Hampshireite, and has been a professional archaeologist for over 20 years now.
Yeah.
Project archaeologist at Monadnock Archaeological Consulting. Gail has undertaken a number of research projects and also has a history podcast about cemeteries, fitting for Halloween, right? It's called The Secret Life of Death.
Just a quick introduction to the project I'll be talking about today. It is the Kchi Pôntegok Petroglyph Project. It's funded through a National Park Service grant, and this work intends to address the notable lack of Indigenous cultural nuance when it comes to the description of this petroglyph site in particular, which we call the Kchi Pôntegok Petroglyphs, or you may know them as the Bellows Falls Petroglyphs over in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And the whole point is to recontextualize what we know about the petroglyphs themselves within the Middle Connecticut River watershed where it's located, and its connection to all sorts of resources, stories, and other connections to other groups within the region. And the region's indigenous and historical archaeological sites included in that. And we really hope that this project provides an understanding of the petroglyphs from an Indigenous perspective, which again has been something very lacking up until recently. Okay, so just some functional housekeeping details about the project itself. I'm one of the two co-managers of the project, the other being Rich Polshu of the Elnu Abenaki. And as I mentioned before, this is funded through a National Park Service grant through their Underrepresented Communities grant, which, according to their information, surveys and inventories historic properties associated with communities underrepresented in the National Register, as well as the development of nominations to the National Register for specific sites. Our project itself is actually administered through the town of Rockingham, Vermont. So we're working on both sides of the river here. Rockingham has a historic commission, and their historic commissioner, Walter Wallace, is doing the day-to-day administration work for us. And he was incredibly important and integral for us to even writing the grant itself. And there are the two managers or co-managers. That's Rich and me. And Rich is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Vermont Elnu, and he's also the director of the Otway Project over in Brattleboro, Vermont. But the majority of our work is done by volunteers, and we have quite a number of them and a really great group, if I do say so myself. We've got Roger Long-Toshian and Linda Long-Toshian of the Elnu Abenaki. We've got Diana Jones. She is a Bellows Falls resident and a member of the Abenaki at Missisquoi. Thomas Martell, who some of you probably know, and he's an archaeologist, but he also had a very strong interest in the petroglyphs and volunteered his time to us. He is an Abenaki from the Amoskeag or Manchester. We have a local master diver and researcher named Annette Spalding, who's done some pretty incredible work in her dives along the Connecticut River, finding all sorts of historic and archaeological sites. And we've also added at the very end a mapping ArcGIS specialist. That's Hale Morrill. And just as a quick side note, the mapping part of our project was something we realized later after we got the grant that was going to be a real necessity for us to process all the information we were coming across. And so I reached out to a number of people, to Mark Greenlee and to Matt Labby, Yvonne Benny Basque, and Garrett Evans, other people within the New Hampshire Archaeological Society community, to help me figure out how we were going to go about and do this mapping stuff. And so I can't thank them enough for being so open and kind and sharing what they knew about the whole ArcGIS process. So they let me pick their brains, and I am eternally grateful for that. So the petroglyphs themselves, the Bellows Falls petroglyphs, are already on the National Register as it is. They are what's known as a contributing site in this Bellows Falls multiple resource listing within the village of Bellows Falls, Vermont. But they're a bit of an anomaly within that listing. all the other sites in that MRA all have to do with the region's 19th and 20th century industrial history of Bellows Falls and the region. And so a main portion of this grant is that we're going to actually be amending that National Register listing to highlight the petroglyphs themselves and set them apart from all of that other industrial history and really showcase what makes them so unique and special unto themselves, but also as an Indigenous site, we don't have don't have a lot of petroglyph sites, so they're a very unique thing. And so while this grant, our work associated with this grant really is specifically aligned to document and having to do with the documentation and classification of the petroglyphs, it's really just the first step in a much larger plan to help protect them into the future. So there we go. So first off, Kchi Pôntegok Petroglyphs. You may not have heard them referred to by this name before. Kchi Pôntegok is a generic Abenaki term meaning at the great falling water, or perhaps you've heard it translated as something like at the Great Falls. And we don't know what the Abenaki name for this place was, but something we do know about Abenaki language is that it's very place oriented. And so whatever this site's name was pre-contact, it very likely had a reference to its location in its name. So we're incorporating that tradition into this name choice. And we do hope it sticks as a way of bringing the site's Indigenous heritage more to the forefront. And so here we are in the pictures here. Here we are at the Great Falling Water. These petroglyphs, if you've never seen them before, well, what are they? Where are they? What do they look like? Here, the first photo. Does this have a pointer?
Yeah, the top button.
Okay.
This is
Oh, this one. There we go. Okay. So this first picture here is showing us. I'm taking a picture from the New Hampshire side of the bridge, so we're looking west across the Connecticut River. This is the Vilas Bridge that crosses the river right there. And so this red arrow pointing down shows us where the petroglyphs are actually located. So you can see that they're right at the base of a very steep bank, which is accentuated by this man-made stone wall right there. And it's sitting on this natural ridge of bedrock, and the snow really highlights that very well, actually, right through there. On this side, we've got another shot. Now I'm standing on the Vilas Bridge on the western side. I'm looking south down the Connecticut River, and here is that ridge again, that ridge of bedrock that we saw in the first picture. And this arrow is pointing to these two yellow sort of slops of paint that somebody added very thoughtfully in the 1960s to help people be able to see the petroglyphs more clearly. And there's actually a couple people right down there looking at the petroglyphs on there. And so when we get on top of that very steep bank and we look over the edge, and really it is literally hanging yourself over the side to get a look at them, this is what we see. This is what they look like. So this is one of two known panels of the petroglyphs, and they're carved into bedrock. And what we are seeing here today are really just faces. Those are the things that have been highlighted, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is later. But right off the bat, you can see that there's some integrity site issues going on here. There's a lot of riprap, this modern riprap going all really surrounding the petroglyphs themselves. So we know that there are some issues with this site going into our research, obviously. But the good thing about that is luckily these petroglyphs have been studied pretty intensively and consistently through beginning in the late 18th century and have been noted and written about quite a bit ever since. So one of the most extensive and exhaustive works about the Bellows Falls petroglyphs is, of course, or the Kchi Pôntegok petroglyphs, was done by Edward Lennox, of course, and this is a picture or a excerpt from his book, Picture Rocks. And in his research, Lennox uncovered correspondence about the Kchi Pôntegok petroglyphs going back to 1791. And it not only mentions the petroglyphs themselves, but you can see here it includes a rough drawing of what the person was observing when they were there. And this area was done by an early naturalist who was traveling through this region. And so this whole stretch of the Connecticut River Valley was a favorite among naturalists all throughout the 19th century prior to the Industrial Revolution. Amherst geologist Edward Hitchcock, who Lake Hitchcock is named after, he knew this area very well. He came to it and studied the cane terraces here right outside of Bellows Falls and in Walpole. And that's what we're looking at here. This is a drawing done by Ora White Hitchcock, his wife, sometime in the 1850s, highlighting the terraces that he loved so much, that are really good examples, apparently, in this area. So they came here a lot to look at those. And this picture is actually titled Terraces of the Gorge at Bellows Falls. So luckily they labeled everything so we can figure out what they were talking about. This view itself is actually a little bit south of the petroglyph site, but this mountain here, which is known as Fall Mountain, just to give you a little perspective, is directly across from the petroglyph site. So the village of Bellows Falls is sort of up in that little canyon there. Okay. And so throughout the 1850s, luckily, the petroglyphs were being photographed and they were drawn. They show up in early histories and travel books about the region. And here we have two etchings done about 1860 of the petroglyphs. They both depict the Kchi Pôntegok Petroglyphs. However, you can notice that there is a difference in what they're actually showing here, a little bit of artistic license and interpretation. The one etching here on the left-hand side is actually is incredibly accurate. And you'll notice that there's not only faces, but there's all sorts of other geometric shapes going on here. And there's circles and lines and all sorts of angular features over here represented in that one. Versus the one on the right-hand side, which unfortunately is really just highlighting the faces. And it's missing all of that all those other geometric pieces that are assigned to it, unfortunately. But I included it just to show two things, to show that there is a little bit of, people's perception of what they're looking at is going to affect how it gets presented and preserved in the record. But also this, even though this one is a little bit flawed, we might say, it's showing us that there's actually two separate panels. And this is one of the only records we have that actually document two separate panels, kind of showing two separate things. So it's still, there's a little to be desired in what it's showing, but it's showing us some other things too that some of the other drawings are leaving out. So as time went on and the area around the petroglyphs was developed into an industrial hub, the petroglyphs were coming under more and more threats. And such was their state of peril by 1929 that the DAR became very worried that they were eroding away so quickly and it wouldn't be long before people wouldn't be able to see them anymore. Not only that, but the power company that owned the land upon which the petroglyphs were located had a plan to blast a channel down through the river so that they could expand their power production. In the end, luckily, thank the DAR, they got the power company to see reason. They didn't go through with their blasting project, so the petroglyphs were saved where they were located. However, the DAR decided that they needed to be recarved so that people could see them going into the future. So they hired a mason, and using metal tools, and going by what the DAR had told them to carve, they selectively carved out just those faces. So again, that's the DAR putting their spin on what they thought was important and leaving out a lot of other things, unfortunately. So by comparing, So just by the comparison of this 1850s rendering versus what we see here today, we can see that there's a big difference in what is actually represented, and all that is there and that all that is actually still missing. So as well-intentioned as the DAR's actions might have been, of course, this is something we would never do today. Their work undoubtedly categorically damaged the integrity of the site, unfortunately. But they're not alone. Of course, there's all sorts of industrial development that was going on all around the petroglyphs themselves. And quite frankly, it's amazing that they survived any of that. But talking about that just helps us highlight this whole concept of how much contextual information concerning the petroglyphs and the culture that that created these carvings is missing nowadays. And so when people ask the inevitable questions of, well, what is this site? What does it mean? Why did they do it? Why is it here? It becomes very difficult to answer those questions without that contextual information. And so that's kind of the jumping off point for our Kchi Pôntegok Petroglyph Project. Our work here is to start by reestablishing as much of that context as we possibly can. And true, we don't have a name for the original Abenaki name for this site anymore, nor do we really have any site-specific stories from the Abenaki about this particular location. We do have a lot of clues sprinkled throughout lore and throughout the landscape and throughout other various documents like archaeological sites in the area, in and around the petroglyphs themselves. And so that's where we've started our work. We're looking for mentions of any mentions about Indigenous people and Native Americans through historical records, through town histories. We're looking at deeds and old maps and newspaper sources from both sides of the river. So this is not just a Vermont project, not just a New Hampshire project, it's a both sides of the river project. We're also drawing from traditional oral histories and stories of the Abenaki and other related groups to see if we can find some contextual information there. And we're looking at where do we see iconography similar to this? Where do we see other petroglyphs in the area? And is there any similarities in the placement of these other petroglyphs? And so as we're also looking at all these different kinds of resources and compiling lists of geological points of interest, geographical landmarks. We're looking at old roads and trails, and we're combining all of those records with the New Hampshire and Vermont SHPO archaeological records, which wonderfully Tanya, Mark, and Jess Robinson over in Vermont have been so wonderful with this project and supporting us and sharing that information, knowing that it's not going to be made public, but it's just for the use of this particular project. And so we're combining all of that stuff for contact period sites, for pre-contact period sites, and into the colonial era in the region. And we've also undertaken a little bit of our own research, some other surveys. We've undertaken some underwater surveys, but with our volunteer master diver Annette Spalding. She has probably one of the most seasoned divers in the Connecticut River Valley, and she has last summer and this summer has spent, I'm not sure how many, probably hundreds of hours at this point, diving in and around the waters in the Connecticut River, right around the Kchi Pôntegok Petroglyphs, to see if there are more authentic petroglyphs down there. And to my knowledge, that's never been done before. So it's pretty exciting that we're actually contributing some new research to this as well. And so far, all of this compilation and all of this other on-the-ground research has generated about 440 points of interest, for lack of a better word. And we're putting all that information on this very boring, sterile-looking spreadsheet and databases that are now we're in the process of uploading that into our ArcGIS programming and starting to map all of that stuff out. And so some of the mapping here shows a few things. This is the extent, it's a little light in the room, unfortunately, but this is the extent of our project area, the wider part of our project area. So we're running roughly from the Massachusetts border up to the White River, up north of the petroglyph site where we are. And even though we're we're including the watershed. So we're going up in the Connecticut River Valley up to the height of land of all of those watersheds within that project area. And while we're primarily focused on a roughly 2-mile area around the petroglyphs themselves, that's where we're focusing most of our research. We thought it was important to expand the area to include some of the wider stretch of the watershed for review as well. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at, again, these geological, geographic, ecological resources that Native people might have utilized. And this whole process of mapping has become an integral tool for us to start to see these points literally on this landscape. And landscape is the operative word here. I've heard Rich Holshoe, my co-conspirator in all of this, and the Elnu, Abenaki, and other people of the group talk about their ideas about relationships of their people to the landscape. Land and the people, they are each other. And that's what that is what they believe, what they've always believed. And so Native people see that humans are intertwined with their environment. They are part of a vast ecological system. And at the heart of their Native worldview is this concept of relationships and connections to each other, to the land, to resources, to all of these things. And so if we really want to understand the Kchi Pôntegok site better, to be able to recontextualize all of these clues, all of these points of interest that we have begun to amass, we need to view it in the same terms of the people who created it. So, which is again why we're mapping, because we need to look at this on the landscape. And when we started to do that, some of these connections became more and more apparent as we went along. And so the landscape itself is giving us a lot of clues already. This region of Southwest New Hampshire, Southeast New Hampshire. So I always get it backwards. Southwest and Southeast Vermont. There we go. Giving us a lot of clues. We have two of some of the oldest Paleo-Indian sites in this region. We've got the Whipple site and the Tennant Swamp site down along the Ashwillet in the lower stretches of our project area. There's also the Skitchawag site, which is on the banks of the Connecticut River in Springfield, Vermont, roughly up here a little bit north of the petroglyphs. The Skitchawag is one of the most meticulously excavated sites in the region, and it's produced evidence of maize cultivation. There's been evidence of human burials in this extensive woodland habitations up there. And we've also got two petroglyph sites in this project area. The Kchi Pôntegok right here in the middle, and there's also another petroglyph site down in Brattleboro, Vermont. And so perhaps nowhere does this concept of connections become more obvious than when we compare these two petroglyph sites. And on the, let's keep doing that. Over here, we've got Bellows Falls, the Bellows Falls petroglyphs. And here is a petroglyph from Brattleboro, Vermont. You can see the outline of a round face. There's eyes and a little mouth right in the middle of it there. And you might have, if you've heard of the Bellows Falls petroglyphs, you might not be as familiar, or vice versa with either one or the other. But in Brattleboro, there's actually two different sets of petroglyphs down in Brattleboro. One of them depicts a whole series of animal figures, and then there's this other one that is clearly a human face, which is uncannily like the ones that we're seeing over here in Bellows Falls. This other petroglyph found in Brattleboro has been rumored for years down there, and it was only rediscovered in 2017 by our crew member, our volunteer member, Annette Spalding. And so it's pretty amazing when you see the two of them next to each other. You can't help but see the similarities, but it goes beyond just the imagery of these two sites. Both sites are right on the Connecticut River. Both are associated with large sheer-faced mountains that are situated to the east of the petroglyphs on the New Hampshire side of the river. They both have a history of human burials having been found on the terraces in and around the petroglyphs, and they are both associated with moving and very turbulent waters. So coming back, we're moving back closer to the Kchi Pôntegok petroglyphs in Bellows Falls. And again, as we are recontextualizing the petroglyphs, the idea is to work within the landscape and the environment. So we have to look at the landscape and the environment. We've got Bellows Falls Village right up here in that little bump. And this very narrow section of the river, this is the falls area of the river here. The petroglyphs are right where that star is, more or less. And then there's that other dot here is kind of the bottom of the rapids of the falls there. We've also got some other interesting things going on in the very, very close vicinity around the petroglyphs. We've got two smaller water tributaries. We've got the Saxons River coming in just south, also the Cold River a little farther south than that. Located on the Saxons River, there is a pretty nice set of falls right there. So that's something important we're also paying attention to. We've got a cold water spring, a very infamous cold water spring down here on the Walpole side in the historic records known as Abenaki Springs. So I think that's also a good clue. We've got Fall Mountain. So it's been a little truncated here by the map, but you get the idea that it is very tall, very steep-sided mountain. Actually, it isn't probably as tall, even the tallest mountain in the region, but what's impressive about it is that when you are in the falls, when you're in the river valley looking up at this sheer mountain in front of you, all rocky and craggly, it is very imposing and impressive for sure. And we've also found at least one location of a rock shelter on the side of Fall Mountain there too. There's probably dozens, if not, tens or even hundreds more on the side, but this is one that we actually do know about. And zooming in a little closer to the falls themselves, there's even more really interesting geographical things about this site. We have the location of the petroglyphs right there where that star is. And you'll notice that it's directly south of that bridge that we saw in those pictures. And we're on the western side. Yeah, I got my directions right this time. We're on the western side of the river here. And here is the steep-sided mountain off to the right hand or the east. And what's interesting about this is this whole stretch is really the rapids. And it's not the falls, it's called Bellows Falls, but they're actually a rapids. And there's a very narrow section right here where the rapids all condense into one spot. So this spot is actually the narrowest spot east-west across the Connecticut River of anywhere on its 430-mile stretch. This is where the first bridge was built in 1784, so that makes total sense. This stretch of rapids is the longest stretch of rapids of anywhere on the Connecticut River. Again, they're not the tallest, but they are the longest stretch of rapids, and historically, the extent to which certain migratory fish could make it because they were, it was just too difficult to make it up over this long stretch here. Again, we talked about the mountain being right there next to you, and it's really quite imposing. And you can imagine before this canal was put in, before all the dams were put in, any kind of water control, the entire flow of the Connecticut River was going through this narrow spot in the bedrock. So you can only imagine how much power was concentrated in that spot. In 1823, our friend, geologist Edward Hitchcock, came through this area. That was the first time he came to Bellows Falls and crossed that bridge, well, not that bridge, but a bridge going across the falls, or right there at the base of the falls. And this is what he remembered about it. He said, "In the middle of the bridge, I stopped and looked into the foaming stream below, where the jagged rocks, half seen amid partial darkness, jutting out from the banks and shooting up from the bottom, presented a real Charybdis, devouring whatever entered its jaws. Dangers enough were visible in the dark waters below, and nothing but the bridge seemed to separate me from destruction. On looking up, I saw the venerable Fall Mountain, rising with its impending precipices and threatening to bury the whole in ruins." So clearly, even in this historic record, the presence and power that were in this place is pretty palpable. And it's there today, it was there back then. And again, prior to any of the fiddling around with the water, you can only imagine how much more impressive it was. So it's all this kind of context that is helping us understand why those petroglyphs are right in that particular spot. It makes a lot of sense. And the context that we're finding doesn't stop there, of course. Historic maps have been giving us a lot of interesting clues about resources Indigenous people might have known about. We're looking at mines in the area for things like graphite, iron oxide, soapstone, and outcroppings of high quality quartz that are in the region. We're also looking at places where early ferry crossings were, or early bridges, because those are the same places that indigenous people used as ferry crossings, or not ferry crossings, but river crossings. And we're again looking at the general things like river confluences and falls and springs, all the things that we've talked about already before. And we're also looking at place names. We don't have a lot of Abenaki words on our maps, particularly in Vermont for various reasons, but the places we do see them, that's something really that we want to pay attention to. So this example here from a 1929 topo map is it really illustrates my point. We've got Skitchewag Mountain here. So we're right outside of Springfield, Vermont. This is pretty close to where the Skitchewag site was. So Skitchewag is an Abenaki word in some form or another. And the maps show us that just north of Skitchewag, we've got Rattlesnake Hill, and just south of Skitchewag on the New Hampshire side, we've also got a Rattlesnake Hill. Rattlesnakes are incredibly important in the cosmology for Abenaki people. So any place where we're seeing things like rattlesnake being mentioned, we're making a note of it. So something tells me that there were probably rattlesnakes here on both sides of the river. It's, you know, highly likely. Our research is also showing indigenous presence, as I mentioned, all the way from the early Paleo period through contact and far beyond. Excuse me. There are all sorts of colonial forts in this section of the river within our project area. As early as the 1730s in Vernon and Brattleboro and Hinsdale, there were English forts down there. Fort number 4 in Charlestown was from the 1740s. And in Walpole, New Hampshire, which is the town right across from Bellows Falls, they were building English forts into the 1850s. So this whole stretch of the river was very active during the colonial period, with trading and fighting many times between the English and the French and the Abenaki. In Walpole itself, 1755 was a big year. There are a series of attacks on some of the English settlements in Walpole itself during the French and Indian War, resulting in reported deaths of both English and Abenaki people at that time. And we have this burial marker. Oh, shoes. This burial marker out in the woods in Walpole that shows us where 2 Englishmen named Flint and Twitchell, who lived and worked at the fort there, Bellows Fort, were killed in 1755. So there's a lot of context with that too. And our stories continued about indigenous people all throughout the 19th century. Lyman Hayes, who wrote the history of Rockingham, Vermont, tells this very detailed story that about in the 1850s, there was an old indigenous man who presumably was Abenaki, who came back to Bellows Falls from up north in his canoe, as Lyman says, to be buried among his people. He knew he was old and frail and dying, and he knew he was going to die soon, and his wish was to be buried with his ancestors. And so there's a very long, as I said, very detailed story about how he stayed the whole summer and into the fall. And when he died, he was reportedly buried in the Restland Cemetery in Bellows Falls. And though there are no burial records that reference this person by name that we can find so far, there are other bits and pieces that we put together that we know roughly where he was buried in the cemetery, at the very least. And so all of these wider connections are very exciting and they're very important. But of course, at the core of all of this are the petroglyphs themselves. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the grant that we're working on and that's funding this research is technically only slated to amend the existing National Register listing for the site. But the context that I've been talking about and that report will provide for the National Park Service is going to set the stage for a lot wider goals for protecting the site into the future. And in terms of preservation, yes, we know that the DAR's work, their misguided efforts over 100 years ago really did a number on the integrity of the site. But we can see here from a photograph from just 2023. It's a little washed out here on the big screen, but it's there. I've highlighted 2 sections of the petroglyph carving or the petroglyph etching that was pretty accurate from the 1850s. And the DAR didn't get everything, luckily. So there are still aspects of some of those panels that remain uncarved to this day. So in this panel, these are roughly the same locations. We've got, you might be able to train your eye on this little rectangular feature with a bunch of dots. It would be that rectangular feature with a bunch of dots. A face, pretty large face up there with eyes and a mouth would be that face right there. And so all the other elements are still there on the petroglyph panel. So so luckily all is not lost. There's some hope for the future as to what might happen. And so that brings me to my closing point about things that are lost. Our Western ideals have really trained us to think in that concept of the binary of lost and found. We've got the lost city of Atlantis, lost nations of or tribes of Israel, and Nixon's lost minutes of tape, etc. That Indigenous history is lost. But is it? If you ask any Abenaki person, of course, they'll say, well, they're not lost. They know where they are. They know where they've been. They'd be very happy to explain it to you, and rightfully so. They are here. Their history is here. It's always been here. We just forgot. So I think our research has borne that out. All of these clues across the records, across time, across this landscape, we are finding all sorts of details if we just look. And if it was known once, it can be known again. And I think so far that is the biggest takeaway that I've learned from working on this project. So thank you very much. Any questions? Is there time? Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's probably fair to assume that on the western shore where the Bellows Bridge is now, the Hale Bridge which preceded it, that right there where the earth shows its bones, there might be some more stuff.
Yes.
It's buried with rubble, essentially sealed in like a time capsule.
Yeah, and this is just right. This is just based on what we know about in the 1850s or the late 1700s, early 1850s. There was a bridge there from 1780 till today. There's been a bridge there. So who knows what is under those pilings? Who knows what had been tampered with in order to make various incarnations of that bridge? That's certainly true. And who knows what's buried under some of that riprap? There could be other things on the New Hampshire side that we don't know. You know, there are some other carvings. I think they've been added later. They are on the New Hampshire side. They're a tomahawk and a bow and arrow. So not typical of what you'd see with a traditional Indigenous. I think it was something somebody added much later, whose idea of what a native person would put for whatever reason, as adding to the petroglyphs. And it's actually something we're seeing quite a bit. Again, the more you look, the more you find people are carving stuff all over the place in the rocks around here. Initials associated with the bridge on the other side, up on the mountain, and some of the other locations in the rock shelter, for instance, there's initials and dates. So there's a tradition of people just carving stuff around the area as well. And you can't discount everything, but also there's some stuff that probably shouldn't be included. But again, we've never really looked holistically at it to figure out what is real, what has been added later, what's been updated, what's somebody's interpretation, clearly, because that has happened here on the site too. So yes.
It's a very large area that you are surveying. Can you speak a little bit to the methodology that you're using to address all that? And I'm also curious about, so you have funding secured, is that like over a certain amount of time? Is it a certain amount of money?
Yes.
And how are you kind of allocating that up for a very large area?
So one of the things that, you know, it's you don't know what you don't know until you realize you don't know it. Aspect played a big part in our research. We had this idea going in with our grant, which is only for 24 months. So we have to be completed with our report that has to go through review with Vermont, since Vermont is the entity, the local entity who's running it. It goes through the Vermont SHPO. But we'll get feedback from New Hampshire as well, and want them to weigh on it for sure. But so we have to be done with the writing of it by pretty soon, sooner rather than, it's a little daunting, but yeah, we have, so to give people time by the middle of summer to have that process of the review process to be underway. And so the funding itself actually just covers paying Rich and I, the directors. Everybody else's work is done is volunteer time in kind to match a certain amount as those grants tend to be. We've also acquired a secondary grant once we got into the project itself and realized that the mapping was going to be such an important component of it, and realizing that none of us had the expertise to be able to do it, to bring on a professional ArcGIS specialist to do that. And we were able to procure a separate Vermont Humanities grant to help pay for that as we went along. And it is a big area. And I think that was the intent going in, is to cover a large area. And I think initially we thought we would do more field work when we started it, but then realizing we were very limited in time and ability to actually do anything, and especially in and around the petroglyphs. If you've never been there, it's kind of, it's very industrial and it's very built up. I'd be so amazed if anything on the ground surface above it was intact to any significant degree. There's been mills there, and so there's brownfield sites there. It's contaminated. It's and there's a huge presence of the railroad has been through there. So there's all kinds of cuts and additions and things like that have added to it. So the actual land above it is probably nowhere near intact, and you'd never even be able to get to it. And there's roads and all sorts of infrastructure. So really, there wasn't going to be a lot of survey work that we could actually do in that project. So luckily, we were able, we also had Annette doing the diving, which added new research to it. And we switched our focus a little bit more on collecting the data that was there and interpreting it in the map format, so that our project evolved a little bit over time as we realized to be able to do what we wanted to do, we had to make some changes. And really, it's been gathering sources. It's been gathering all of this research material that all of the people involved in the project have been kind of doing on their own for years, because they love this place. They think it's very interesting. They want something protected and something done about it. So pooling all of everybody's information they've already researched, talking to other people and pulling them in on the project. And one of the funny things about working on this site itself is because it's in Vermont, but it's on the Connecticut River, and it's it actually functions in the wider landscape. It's not just a site associated with Vermont. Obviously, those are political boundaries or something that didn't exist at the time. So it's kind of silly to just study it in terms of the sites in Vermont or just the sites in New Hampshire. You really have to look at both sides of the river. And this area has been kind of overlooked. We're not in the urban center of New Hampshire. We're nowhere near the urban centers of Vermont. The kind of development that happens in some of these other places has never happened here. So we have a little bit less representation in the archaeological record, for sure, because there's just not a lot of CRM stuff that happens, and that's where you get a lot of your information. And just the population, the awareness of it isn't there, because there just aren't as many people in and around the area to know about it. So we're also expanding, having a larger expanded research area, I think, helps draw more people into it as well. And it might make a little more work for us, but we've really just narrowed it down into very, very boring and ugly data tables, but that's kind of how you have to do it, and associate it, just being very organized. I know that's so boring and milquetoast, but you're just being organized with all of our information and our data and how we're putting it together and how we're saving it and how we're preserving it. So that's been a big part of it, is just organizing and data sets and tables and stuff like that will make lovely maps when we are to it, and show lots of really cool stuff in very cool ways, but isn't exciting and sexy in the early stages. But that's what we've been focusing more on.